Welcome back. If you want me to keep telling these stories, stick around for more. It began as a quiet, uneventful evening. My wife had taken our 1-year-old out for the afternoon, and the house felt still, with only the soft hum of everyday life filling the background. I wrapped up the last of my work, grateful for the peaceful moment, before heading out to grab some dinner around 4:30 p.m. The sun was just beginning to set, casting a warm, golden light across the yard, the kind that makes everything feel oddly serene. When I returned home around 6:30, the house greeted me with that familiar sense of quiet, but it felt slightly different. It could have been the absence of the usual commotion with our child, or maybe it was just the calm before my wife and baby would return, but there was a subtle tension in the air that I couldn't quite place. I played with our dog for a bit. His usual excitement seemed oddly tempered, and went through my usual routine of small chores, trying to shake off the feeling. By 7:30, my wife returned, and the house felt more normal again, filled with the sounds of family. We settled in to relax, and despite the odd feeling earlier, nothing seemed particularly out of the ordinary. Around 9 p.m., I decided to head to bed early, knowing that I'd likely be up early with our little one, as usual. Yet, there was still that lingering feeling, like a faint static in the back of my mind, something I couldn't quite name but chose to ignore. Just as I settled into bed, the usual comfort of the sheets did little to ease the faint sense of unease I had felt earlier. Barely 2 minutes had passed when my phone buzzed with a text from my wife. It seemed odd, she was just downstairs. The message was simple, but jarring, a picture of our dry erase menu board hanging on the fridge. At first glance, I thought it was a prank, or maybe I had misremembered how it looked earlier. My wife typically updates it at the beginning of the week with our dinner plans. Nothing fancy, just her neat, familiar handwriting laying out the meals for the days ahead. I distinctly recalled seeing it that morning, fully filled out, just as it always was. But the picture she sent now showed something else entirely. The once orderly menu was completely scrambled, as if someone had run their hand wildly across it. Words were misshapen, some half erased, others replaced by strange scribbles that didn't make sense. A few letters remained in her writing, but they were out of place, like fragments of a sentence in a language I couldn't decipher. What was most unsettling, though, was the presence of unfamiliar handwriting. Scrawls that neither of us recognized, forming incomplete words and strange symbols that seemed hurried, almost frantic, as if whoever had written them was in a rush or distracted. My mind raced. Our 1-year-old was far too young to be capable of something like this, and our dog certainly hadn't done it. There was no one else in the house. There couldn't have been. Yet there it was, staring back at me, a distorted version of something so routine. It was as if a quiet invasion had taken place, leaving behind this eerie, chaotic trace of an unseen presence. The unsettling image of the scrambled menu clung to my thoughts as I hurried downstairs to meet my wife. We exchanged bewildered looks, each of us trying to make sense of the bizarre scene in our own way. Neither of us had touched the board after she filled it out earlier in the week, and with our child too young to reach it, the realization crept in that someone or something else had been there. The house, which had once felt like a sanctuary of quiet comfort, now seemed like an unfamiliar space. It didn't take long for us to decide to call the county sheriff. Living in the countryside, calls like this are rare, and as we waited for his arrival, the silence of the house became more oppressive. Every creak in the floor, every gust of wind against the window seemed amplified, as if the house itself were holding its breath, waiting for something to reveal itself. I checked the doors and windows, but everything was as it should be. Nothing was out of place, and yet the air felt charged with something unseen. When the sheriff arrived, his demeanor, typically calm and matter-of-fact, shifted as we showed him the board. He examined it closely, the lines on his face deepening as if even he, a seasoned officer, felt the strangeness of the situation. He swept the house from top to bottom, checking every door, every window, every corner, but nothing. No signs of forced entry, no misplaced objects, nothing that would suggest an intruder, and yet he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling either. "I don't usually get calls like this out here," he admitted, his voice lower than usual. almost as if he didn't want to disturb the quiet further. Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "I'd recommend you change your locks, just in case. You never know." He glanced at us before leaving, the unease still lingering in his eyes, as if he, too, felt there was more to the story than met the eye. That night, we followed his advice without hesitation. The locks were changed within hours, and though it brought a small sense of security, the strangeness of the incident lingered in our minds. The house felt safe again, but the memory of that disordered menu board remained, as though it had been a quiet, cryptic warning that something, or someone, had passed through our home, leaving behind no trace but an unsettling riddle. So, this was a few years ago, back when my friend and I were in that phase where sneaking out at night felt like the coolest thing ever. We didn't have anything specific to do, just bored teenagers looking for a bit of excitement. Most nights, we'd just wander around his neighborhood, trying to stay out of sight, ducking into bushes or behind cars when we saw headlights coming. It wasn't anything wild, but it gave us that little rush like we were getting away with something. Now, not far from his house, there was this homeless camp tucked away in the woods, right near the railroad tracks. We'd always been curious about it because we knew it was there, but had never really gone that far down the trail to check it out. Here's the thing, though. One of the guys who lived there wasn't just some random stranger. He was actually an old friend of my buddy's dad. The guy would stop by every now and then to shower or grab a bite to eat. He wasn't your typical homeless person. He wasn't struggling or anything. He could have worked if he wanted to, but straight up told us that he liked living off the grid. He didn't want to deal with bills, routines, or society in general. That always kind of fascinated us, how someone could choose that lifestyle. So, knowing this guy was back there made the whole idea of sneaking into the camp feel a lot less dangerous. We figured if we ran into him, it wouldn't be a big deal. He knew my buddy's dad, so we thought we'd be fine. In our heads, it was just a harmless adventure. But, of course, it was still night, and there was that little thrill of, what if, you know? It wasn't something you'd tell your parents about, but it seemed safe enough in our teenage brains. That's why we decided to sneak out and check out the camp, even though part of us knew we might be biting off more than we could chew. We finally made the decision to head out, and as soon as we were out of the house, that rush of excitement kicked in. You know how it is. Everything feels more alive at night when you're doing something you probably shouldn't be. The cool air, the quiet of the neighborhood, the thrill of sneaking around, it all added to that sense of adventure. The walk started off pretty chill, but it was longer than we expected. We'd walked that area before during the day, but at night, with just a couple of flashlights, everything looked different. The trees seemed bigger, the shadows darker, and the sounds of the woods were louder, like every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves made your heart race just a little faster. We were getting closer, and I remember that sudden feeling of unease creeping in. The trail leading toward the camp was narrow, winding through thick brush and trees, and even though we couldn't see the camp yet, we could smell the faint scent of smoke. Someone definitely had a fire going. That was our first real sign that people were there. Up ahead, the trail kept going straight, but off to the left, we could finally make out the faint glow of a fire lighting up the woods. The flickering light bounced off the trees, casting long, shifting shadows. We got this little adrenaline rush seeing it, like, okay, we're really doing this. But then, things started to feel off. As we crept closer, staying low and trying to stay quiet, we noticed something strange. There, down the trail in front of us, maybe about 100 feet away, we saw it, a silhouette. At first, we thought it was just one of the people from the camp walking back from the woods, maybe gathering firewood or something. But there was something about the way it moved that made us pause. The figure was coming from deeper in the woods, not from the direction of the camp, and it was just standing there, barely moving. We immediately froze. The firelight was just bright enough to let us see, but the rest of the woods were dark, and the figure was standing in the shadows. We couldn't make out any details. No face, no features, just the outline of what looked like a person. For a few seconds, we didn't know what to do. My heart was racing, and I could tell my friend was just as freaked out. We ducked off to the side of the trail, staying low behind some bushes, trying to figure out what was going on. The woods were dead silent, except for the crackling of the fire in the distance, and something about that stillness made the whole situation even creepier. We didn't know if the person had seen us, or if they were just walking back to the camp. Either way, it didn't feel right. It wasn't the harmless adventure we'd thought it would be anymore. That's when we started to realize that maybe this wasn't as safe as we had convinced ourselves it would be. As we crouched there, trying to make sense of what we were seeing, I turned to my friend and whispered, "Man, I don't like this. We should get out of here." He didn't hesitate. He nodded, and I could tell he had the same bad feeling I did. It wasn't just the fact that we were sneaking around in the woods at night anymore. It was the strange behavior of the silhouette that was really starting to freak us out. The way it stood there, almost too still, made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Something just felt wrong. That's when everything went from eerie to terrifying. The figure wasn't just moving toward us anymore. It was running, and fast. My heart felt like it was going to explode out of my chest. The most unsettling part? It was dead silent. No footsteps pounding on the trail, no rustling of branches or leaves. It was like this thing, whatever it was gliding toward us at an unnatural speed. My friend and I didn't need to exchange any more looks or words. We knew it was time to run. And when I say run, I mean we ran for our lives. The trail was wide, which was a blessing. It meant we could both take off at full speed without tripping over each other or running into trees. But in the back of my mind, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being hunted. My legs were pumping, my lungs were burning, but all I could think about was how close that silhouette had gotten, how fast it was moving without making a sound. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to go faster, to get out of there as quickly as possible. Even though we were both pretty athletic, we played football, so we weren't slow. It felt like no matter how fast we ran, that thing could catch up to us at any moment. I didn't dare look back. I didn't want to see how close it had gotten. All I could hear was the sound of my own breathing and the pounding of my feet against the ground. The forest around us felt like it was closing in, the trees seeming darker and more oppressive as we sprinted down the trail. We reached the railroad tracks in what felt like seconds, but it could have been minutes. It was hard to tell with all the adrenaline pumping through me. As soon as we hit the tracks, we didn't stop. We kept running, our only goal being to get as far away from that thing as possible. The tracks were a straight shot, and after what felt like an eternity, we finally made it to the railroad bridge. We didn't slow down until we were on the other side, our breaths ragged, hearts pounding. Once we crossed the bridge, I allowed myself a quick glance back, just to make sure we weren't being followed. There was nothing, no silhouette, no movement, just the stillness of the woods. I was half expecting to see that figure standing at the edge of the tracks, watching us, but it was like whatever had chased us had disappeared. I can't describe the relief I felt, but it was mixed with that lingering feeling of dread, like we had narrowly escaped something we weren't meant to encounter. We didn't say much after that. We made it back to my friend's house in record time, barely able to catch our breath. I remember my legs feeling like jelly, my body exhausted from the run, but the fear kept me awake for hours. We didn't talk about it much after that night. There wasn't much to say. Whatever, or whoever, that silhouette was, we didn't want to know. All we knew was that it had chased us, fast and silent, and we'd been lucky enough to get away. To this day, I can't explain what happened out there. Maybe it was a person, maybe it wasn't, but the way it moved, the silence that surrounded it, the eerie speed, it just didn't feel right. We had gone out there looking for a little adventure, maybe even some harmless excitement, but we got more than we bargained for. That chase, that fear of being hunted in the dark, is something I'll never forget. First off, let me tell you a bit about myself. I'm a passionate catfisher, and I love the tranquility of fishing at night when everything is calm and quiet. I tend to stay out quite late, especially on nights when I don't have work the next day. That leads me to why I was at this lake, experiencing something I'll never forget. I can't remember the exact day, but I was alone. My girlfriend at the time didn't want to come, and none of my friends could be convinced either. So I thought, why not? I'll just go solo. I grabbed my fishing gear and, for safety, brought along some personal protection. After a few hours of fishing and catching a few, I started hearing voices in the distance. I couldn't see anyone, so I figured they must be on the road nearby and shrugged it off. Fast forward a couple of hours. This is a city lake, so it's fairly well lit in most areas, and I hear a whistle. I looked around but didn't see or hear anything else, so I resumed fishing. Then another whistle, this time from my right. It crossed my mind that it might be some kids messing around, but this whistle felt intentional, like someone wanted to get my attention. Still, I saw and heard nothing. I turned around and noticed a cat nearby. Thinking nothing of it, I went back to fishing. Suddenly, another whistle, this time behind me. The cat was gone. I reeled in my lines. Catfish are strong, and I wasn't about to lose a $200 pole, and quietly put my hand on my protection, just in case. I circled around a nearby building, but there was no one in sight. Odd, considering the gravel underfoot should have made any movement easy to hear. As I turned to walk back, I heard a loud, shrill whistle right behind me, sharp enough to make me spin around, heart racing. I decided it was time to go. I packed up my gear quickly and made my way to the car. Fast forward to a week later, either Friday or Saturday night. A friend and I went back to the same spot. I had almost forgotten about the whistling. We were having a good time fishing when I started noticing shadows in the trees across the lake, like something was darting between the lights and jumping around. I brushed it off as my mind playing tricks on me in the dark. My friend, however, told me later that he saw the same thing. Around 3 a.m., I started hearing people chatting, but I couldn't see anyone, which was strange, since the lake is surrounded by roads and it's hard not to see anyone walking by. I felt a bit uneasy, but I kept fishing. Then around 3:15 a.m., I heard birds chirping. Now this struck me as odd. It was still the middle of the night. I turned to my friend and said, "Do you hear birds chirping? Isn't that strange for 3 a.m.? He glanced around, looking a bit paranoid, and after a moment he replied, "Those aren't birds chirping. Someone's mimicking them." Confused, I asked him what he was talking about, and he reminded me of a story a coworker had told me. A story about why no one was allowed to swim in the lake anymore. He said, "How many people you know?" As soon as he said that, everything went dead silent. The crickets stopped, the wind stilled, the fish quit biting. In fact, I was pulling in a catch and the line just went slack, and it felt like you could hear a pin drop. "Do you feel that?" he asked, and I nodded. My chest felt tight, and it was suddenly hard to breathe. There was this overwhelming sense of dread hanging in the air. My friend looked around and said, "Let's pack up and get out of here." I agreed, and we started packing up in a hurry. The chirping started up again as we grabbed the rest of our gear. Just as we were about to leave, my friend suddenly turned around with his knife out, and I instinctively reached for my protection. "We need to leave now," he said. We rushed to the car, and as we drove off, I asked him, "What made you pull your knife like that?" He looked at me, dead serious, and said, "Something was running behind us, like it was charging." The events surrounding what happened to me that night are still a blur. I have only a hazy recollection of it, but the physical evidence afterward proves that something did, in fact, happen. Let me set the stage. I had gone to a van life meetup in Enumclaw, Washington, a small city near Mount Rainier National Park. Since I was already in the area, I figured I'd camp overnight in one of the dispersed camping spots in the nearby forest. I had brought ingredients to make carne asada tacos, downloaded a couple of movies, and was ready for a cozy evening in my van, something I often did on weekends in different campsites around the state. After a short hike around the area, I noticed that the campsite, while nice, was marred by a disappointing amount of litter. Trash was scattered everywhere, which dampened the mood a little. The trail I was on led me to 2 fire pits not far from where I had parked, ending at a peaceful riverbank. It seemed like a spot that local teens might frequent, with a log bench boldly painted with 420 on it. There were also half-drunk cans left around the fire pits, but they didn't seem to have been there long. Although I briefly wondered if people had been there recently, I shrugged it off and decided to stay. After all, the temperature was about 70 degrees, and the cans felt a bit cold, but nothing too unusual. The spot wasn't particularly isolated. Every half hour or so, a truck or RV would roll by, with people claiming campsites farther down the road. These were fellow nature enthusiasts, people like me, looking for an inexpensive place to stay the night. After exploring a bit, I went back to my van to start making dinner. Without phone service this deep in the forest, I used my satellite communicator to check in with friends and family, just as I usually did. As the sun began to set, I sat down to enjoy my tacos, leaving the van doors open to let the cool evening breeze flow through. It felt amazing, until I started hearing strange noises in the distance. At first I ignored it, but it became hard to dismiss. They sounded like deep, rhythmic booms, almost like cannon fire, echoing through the valley. The steady thrum was accompanied by what sounded like a chainsaw somewhere off in the distance. Now, neither of these sounds are all that unusual when camping in remote areas. People in Washington are known to enjoy target shooting, and chainsaws aren't uncommon for cutting wood, even during summer fire bans. What caught my attention, though, was when I saw some campers, especially an RV, leaving, despite it being well past sunset. It's hard enough to find a good spot for an RV during the day, let alone at night, which made their departure even stranger. I briefly considered following their lead, but I was tired, had unwashed dishes in the van, and just wasn't in the mood to move. So I stayed. However, before going to sleep, I triple-checked that all my doors and windows were locked. That night was disorienting. I can't recall much of what happened, but it was clear by morning that something had. I remember waking up in the pitch-black darkness, struggling to breathe, not as if I was choking, but as though I was drowning. My lungs were working, but the air just didn't seem to be enough. I recall a desperate panic trying to punch the windows, to no avail. I fumbled my way to the side doors of my van, trying to get out, gasping for air. And then I woke up in bed with the sun in the sky. At first, I thought it must have been a bad dream, but the state of my van told a different story. There was evidence of a struggle. My window blinds were torn, one of my windows was scratched from the inside, and the air vent on the ceiling was completely wrecked. I couldn't understand how I could have done this. The van had been well ventilated, so there was no reason I should have struggled to breathe. My carbon monoxide detector hadn't gone off, and everything was set up properly after cooking. I checked the van again. There were no signs of forced entry, and the damage seemed to have been caused by me trying to get out. My knuckles were sore, likely from hitting various hard surfaces inside the van. My feet ached, probably from stumbling into the cabinets. Oddly enough, a pole I used to prop up my canopy was lying in the middle of the floor, broken at both ends, though I had no recollection of touching it. Whatever happened that night remains a mystery, but the aftermath was unmistakable. Something definitely occurred, and I'm still trying to piece it all together. It was a typical evening for a 10-year-old in Mesa, Arizona. I lived in a rough neighborhood, but at that age, I didn't grasp what that meant. To me, it was simply home, and danger never crossed my mind. That night, like many others, I'd been at my friend's house, playing games, chatting about nothing in particular, and losing track of time. My mom's rule was to be home by 9 p.m. sharp, and I knew better than to be late. So at 8:40, I started my short walk home. It wasn't far, just a couple of blocks, so I knew I had plenty of time. It was that time of year when the sun set really early, around 5:30, so by 8:40, the night was pitch black. The streets were mostly quiet, the kind of stillness that comes when everyone's already settled in for the night. The air was cool, and the only sounds were the occasional car in the distance and the rustling of leaves underfoot. It was a route I had taken countless times, so I wasn't in a hurry or nervous. In my head, it was just a routine walk, one I didn't even need to think about. As I turned the corner onto my street, I felt comfortable, like I was in my own world. I wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary, but then, out of nowhere, I heard someone call my name. It wasn't just any voice, it was familiar. I turned around and saw a woman standing a little distance away. It took me a second to recognize her, but then it clicked. She was one of my mom's friends. I didn't know her well, but I'd seen her around before. That made me feel safe. There was no reason to think anything was wrong. I smiled and said hello as she approached. She seemed friendly enough, and I had no reason to question why she was there. I mean, this was someone who knew my mom. I didn't think twice about it. But what she said next would set off a series of events that I'll never forget. As the woman got closer, she didn't waste any time. She immediately told me that my mom had called her and asked her to come pick me up because there was some kind of emergency at home. I didn't know this woman very well, but she was familiar enough that I didn't feel alarmed at first. She was calm, smiling, and seemed to have a good explanation. She said her husband, who my family also knew, was waiting in the car just down the street. I could even see the car parked a little way off. It didn't seem strange at the time because I knew they were connected to my mom somehow. Even though I was only 5 minutes from my house, the word emergency immediately caught my attention. My mind started racing. I was trying to piece together what could have possibly happened. I remember feeling a twinge of worry. Maybe something really had gone wrong. After all, she mentioned my mom, and why would someone make up an emergency, right? That was enough to make me agree to go with her. In my head, it made sense. If something bad was happening at home, I needed to get there quickly. She made it sound like she was doing my mom a favor, helping out in a time of crisis. But as we started walking toward the car, something changed. It's hard to explain, but I suddenly got this weird feeling deep in my stomach. It wasn't fear yet, more like discomfort, a sense that something wasn't adding up. My legs started feeling shaky, and my mind, which had been racing with thoughts about the emergency, was now filled with doubt. I was too young to fully understand what was happening, but looking back, I know my instincts were kicking into high gear. Something was wrong, even if I couldn't put my finger on it at the time. As we got closer to the car, the feeling only got stronger. I hesitated for a second and stopped walking, just long enough to ask, "Can we call my mom?" I needed to hear her voice to confirm that everything was okay. But the woman didn't even blink. She quickly responded, saying that my mom was in the hospital and couldn't talk right now, which is why she was there to get me. That was the first real red flag. The way she brushed off my request and how she insisted we needed to hurry set off alarm bells in my head. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. But before I could even fully process it, we were standing right next to the car, and she was opening the door for me to get in. That's when I heard it, my mother's voice, shouting my name as loudly as she could. It was like a jolt of electricity running through me. I immediately spun around, my heart pounding in my chest, and saw my mom, standing a short distance away, calling out to me. I didn't waste a second. I turned and walked straight toward her, the sense of relief flooding over me. But in that moment, I knew something was very, very wrong. As soon as I heard my mom's voice and saw her standing there, everything in me shifted from confusion to clarity. I quickly walked over to her, my heart pounding in my chest, the eerie feeling still lingering. My mom looked worried, and her eyes immediately darted to the woman who had just told me there was an emergency. I could see the tension building on her face, but she didn't say anything at first. She just waited for me to explain. Without thinking twice, I blurted out, "She said there was an emergency at home and that you sent her to get me." I remember the look on my mom's face so vividly. It was a mixture of shock and disbelief, but also anger. It was like everything clicked for her in that moment, and her expression shifted from concern to something much more intense. Her eyes narrowed as she turned to the woman, and you could feel the energy between them change. It was like my mom realized, right then and there, what had almost happened. She didn't need to hear any more. The woman, sensing my mom's growing hostility, tried to interrupt me, likely to cover her tracks and explain herself. She spoke quickly, saying, "Oh no, I just saw him walking and thought I'd give him a ride home. No big deal." Her tone was casual, as if she hadn't just told me moments earlier that my mom was in the hospital and I needed to hurry into her car. But my mom wasn't buying it. She cut the woman off, her voice sharp but calm. Calm in that way that only someone who's about to explode can be. "I know what you were trying to do," my mom said, her voice shaking with anger. "You were trying to take my son." Hearing those words sent chills down my spine. It was the moment everything became real, not just to her, but to me too. Until that point, I had been trying to make sense of what was happening, convincing myself that maybe this was all just a misunderstanding. But when my mom said those words, I realized this wasn't some innocent mistake. I had been in real danger. My mom's words seemed to stun the woman. Her face went pale, and I saw her glance nervously at the car where her husband was sitting. He had stayed quiet the entire time, but now he seemed to be panicking too. I saw him look out the car window and hurry to grab something off the dashboard, a syringe leaning against the windshield. He grabbed it so quickly, like he didn't want anyone to notice, but it was too late. I had seen it, and so had my mom. The sight of that syringe made everything clear. Whatever they had planned, it was far worse than I had even imagined. As the tension mounted, I could feel my mom gearing up to protect me. She reached into her purse, and I knew what she was going for: her pocket knife. She always carried it for protection, but I had never seen her look so ready to use it. The air was thick with fear and anger. It felt like anything could happen in that moment. But before my mom could make a move, the woman turned and quickly got into the car. The husband started the engine, and they sped off, leaving us standing there in the dark. My mom stood still for a moment, watching them drive away, and then she turned to me. Her face softened, but the fear and anger were still there. She didn't say anything at first. She just pulled me into a tight hug, like she was afraid to let go. I could feel her shaking, and before I knew it, she burst into tears, holding me like she never wanted to lose me. "I almost lost you," she whispered through her tears. I didn't fully understand what she meant at the time, but I knew enough to realize that I had narrowly escaped something terrible. Even though I was still in shock, I tried to convince myself that maybe it wasn't as serious as it seemed, that I wasn't really in danger. But deep down, I knew better. The fear in my mom's eyes, the syringe, the way they sped off, it all added up to something far worse than my 10-year-old mind could fully grasp. As we walked home that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been inches away from a disaster. My mom knew it too, and the way she held me close the entire way home told me that she wasn't going to let anything like that happen again. That night changed everything for me. It was the moment I learned to trust that gut feeling, that instinct that tells you when something's wrong, even when you can't explain why. Looking back now, I realize just how close I came to real danger, and it still sends shivers down my spine. It was supposed to be an uneventful weekend. My friend was 15 at the time, and his parents had gone away for a long trip, leaving him home alone for the first time over an extended weekend. He wasn't too worried about it. After all, he was old enough to handle himself, and everything seemed pretty normal at first. The house was quiet, the evening was peaceful, and he was upstairs in his bedroom, probably playing video games or scrolling through his phone, enjoying the solitude. The sun had already set, and by 7 or 8 p.m., the house was dark except for the faint glow of lights from his room. Being alone in the house didn't bother him much at first. It was something we all kind of looked forward to at that age. Having the house to yourself, no parents around, total freedom. But as the night went on, the stillness of the house began to feel a little heavier. He told me later that the silence seemed almost too thick, like the quiet was pressing in on him in a way he couldn't quite explain. The neighborhood outside was calm, nothing out of the ordinary, and there wasn't a single sign that anything strange was about to happen. But then, as he sat in his room, the silence was abruptly broken by a familiar sound, his mom's voice calling up the stairs. She was calling him for dinner, just like she'd done 100 times before. Only this time, something felt off. He immediately froze, his mind racing. His parents weren't supposed to be home for another day or two, so how could his mom be there already? At first, he thought maybe he misheard it. Maybe it was his imagination playing tricks on him, or maybe he'd been so wrapped up in what he was doing that he lost track of time. But then it happened again. His mom's voice was unmistakable, clear as day. calling his name from downstairs. He poked his head out of his bedroom door, confused and a little uneasy. The hallway was empty, and the staircase leading down was dark. No sign of anyone. That sinking feeling crept in, the kind where you know something doesn't add up, but you don't want to acknowledge it yet. He stood there for a second, not moving, his heart pounding in his chest. Everything in his gut told him something was wrong, but the voice had sounded so real, so familiar, that he couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, somehow, his mom was really home early. He called back down, his voice shaky. "Mom, are you home already?" There was a pause, a long beat of silence, and then the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps coming from the direction of the kitchen. A chill ran down his spine as he waited, every instinct telling him something wasn't right. And then, as if out of nowhere, his mom appeared at the bottom of the stairs, stepping out from around the corner. She was smiling up at him, just standing there, staring. But that smile, it was the kind that made his skin crawl. Something about the way she looked at him, the silence that followed, made the air in the house feel thick with unease. He couldn't explain why, but in that moment, he felt more afraid than he ever had before. For a moment, my friend just stood there, staring down at what appeared to be his mom. She stood at the bottom of the stairs, smiling up at him, but the smile wasn't warm or familiar. It was too still, almost frozen on her face. She didn't say a word, just stared at him. Normally, his mom would have called out or asked how his day was, but this time, nothing, just silence. He started to feel that creeping dread, the kind that tells you something is off, but you can't quite put your finger on it. She had called him for dinner. He could still hear her voice in his mind, clear and familiar. But now, standing there, she wasn't saying a thing. She just turned, slowly, and walked back toward the kitchen. Her movements were unnervingly calm, deliberate, as if she wasn't in any kind of rush. There was something unnatural about it, like she was moving in slow motion, not quite like herself. My friend's gut was screaming at him that something was terribly wrong. But the rational part of his brain kept trying to brush it off. "It's just Mom," he told himself. "Maybe she's tired from the trip, or maybe she's playing a joke." But no matter how much he tried to explain it away, the oddness of her silence kept gnawing at him. His instincts were on high alert, telling him that something about this wasn't right. He had seen her, but hadn't heard her speak when she was standing there. That tiny detail, the fact that she never actually opened her mouth to speak, sent a chill down his spine. The voice calling him to dinner and the figure standing at the bottom of the stairs weren't lining up in his mind. He heard her voice and he saw her, but not at the same time. It was like there were two separate things happening, disconnected in a way that made his skin crawl. His mom had called him just moments ago, and yet, when she appeared, she hadn't spoken a single word. She just stood there, smiling that unnatural smile, before disappearing back into the kitchen. The air in the house felt heavy now, almost oppressive. The usual comfort of home had vanished, replaced by a sense of dread that he couldn't shake. He could still hear her voice echoing in his mind, calling him to dinner. But that smile was wrong. It was too perfect, too calm, like a mask someone was wearing. His legs felt rooted to the spot, and for a brief second he considered going down the stairs to see what was going on. Maybe his mind was just playing tricks on him, but something deep inside stopped him. That same unsettling detail, how her lips never moved when she stood there, kept replaying in his head. His instinct, that primal gut feeling, told him not to follow. Something about her silence, the way she moved, just felt off. And in that moment, he decided it was better to stay upstairs. His heart was pounding in his chest as he backed away from the stairs, every nerve in his body on edge. Without thinking, he slammed his bedroom door shut and locked it, as if that thin wooden door was enough to keep whatever was downstairs away from him. With shaking hands, he grabbed his phone and dialed his mom's number. The ringing seemed to drag on forever, each second feeling like an eternity, until finally, she answered. The moment he heard her voice on the other end, his heart sank. His real mom was still hundreds of miles away, several states over, completely unaware of what had just happened at home. She was nowhere near the house. The voice that had called him to dinner, the figure he had seen at the bottom of the stairs, none of it made sense now. Panic set in as the realization hit him. Whoever or whatever had been downstairs wasn't his mom. It had looked like her, sounded like her, but something was horribly wrong. When his mom answered the phone, it was like the air was sucked out of the room. Her voice, calm and clear, confirmed the worst. She was still several states away, nowhere near home. For a moment, he couldn't even speak, his mouth dry as the weight of what just happened hit him like a ton of bricks. He had heard her voice so clearly, felt the familiar comfort of her presence. But she wasn't there. The figure he had seen, the smile that had unnerved him, wasn't his mom. He finally managed to stammer out what had just happened. His voice was shaky, filled with the kind of fear that comes when you realize that something completely unexplainable just took place. He described how he'd heard her call him, how she appeared at the bottom of the stairs, smiling up at him before walking back into the kitchen. The more he talked, the more real it all became, and the more terrified he felt. His mom was silent on the other end of the line, trying to process what he was saying. Finally, she told him to stay in his room, lock the door, and call the police. The rational part of him wanted to believe it was all some kind of misunderstanding, that maybe someone had broken into the house, or that his mind was playing tricks on him. But deep down, he knew. The way she had smiled, the way her lips never moved when she was supposed to be talking, it didn't feel like a person. It felt like something else. He dialed 911 with trembling fingers, his hands still shaking as he explained the situation to the dispatcher. The minutes that passed while he waited for the police to arrive felt like hours. Every little sound in the house seemed amplified, as if the walls themselves were alive, holding their breath. He didn't dare unlock the door or leave his room. His heart pounded in his chest, his mind replaying the image of his mom, at the bottom of the stairs over and over again. That smile, so unsettling, was burned into his memory. When the police finally arrived, the house was silent. They searched every room, checked every door and window, but nothing was out of place. The house was still locked up, the security system was on, and there were no signs of an intruder. It was as if the figure had vanished into thin air, leaving no trace behind. But my friend knew what he saw. The police were polite but skeptical, reassuring him that everything was fine, that no one had broken in. But he wasn't fine. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had been in the house with him, something that knew his mother's voice, her face, and had tried to lure him downstairs. The realization that whatever it was had been so close, so convincing, left him rattled in a way he had never experienced before. It was one thing to hear a strange noise or feel like someone's watching you. It was another to see a figure you thought was your mom, only to find out it was something else entirely. After that night, he refused to stay in the house alone. The thought of being in that place without anyone else around terrified him. Even when his parents came back, the house didn't feel the same. The memory of that eerie encounter haunted him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that, for a brief moment, something had tried to trick him into coming downstairs. Something that wasn't his mom, but wanted him to believe it was. To this day, he still doesn't know what it was. Whether it was a spirit, a ghost, or something more sinister, he can't say. All he knows is that it looked like his mother, sounded like her, but in the moments that mattered most, it wasn't her. And that smallest of details, the smile, the silence, was enough to keep him from falling into whatever trap had been laid for him that night.